Imagine you are looking at a monitoring dashboard for an application that has been running quietly all afternoon. Traffic is steady, no spikes, no unusual patterns, nothing out of the ordinary. But the server count graph looks like a heartbeat monitor. Up to 6 servers, down to 4, back up to 6, down to 4 again. The cycle repeats every few minutes, regular as clockwork, with no obvious cause. Your auto-scaling is working. It is definitely scaling, but it cannot seem to settle. It adds capacity, then immediately removes it, then adds it again. The infrastructure is consuming itself. This is scaling oscillation. It is one of the more disorienting things you can see in a live system, because it looks like the system is making decisions. It is, but those decisions are contradicting each other faster than the situation requires. Something in the policy configuration is producing a feedback loop, and the loop has no exit condition. Before getting to why this happens, consider what it costs. Every time a new server is added, there is a provisioning cycle. Resources are allocated, an operating system is booted, the application starts up, the cache begins cold. Every time a server is removed, existing connections have to be drained and requests redistributed. Each cycle costs time, costs money, and introduces a small window of instability as the load balancer adjusts. 1 or 2 such cycles during a genuine traffic event is expected and fine. A cycle every 3 minutes during flat traffic is pure overhead with no benefit. The system burning energy to return continuously to a state it has already been in, over and over. The effect on users can be real. Every new server added during an oscillation cycle is a cold server, and cold servers are slower than warm ones. If the oscillation is frequent enough, a meaningful fraction of the server pool is in a cold state at any given moment. Not because demand required it, but because the policy keeps cycling capacity in and out for no reason. Here is an analogy that makes the cause visible. Imagine a home heating system controlled by a thermostat. You set the target temperature to exactly 20 degrees. The rule is rigid. The boiler turns on the moment the temperature drops below 20 and turns off the moment it reaches 20. In theory, the house stays at 20 degrees. In practice, the boiler turns on, heats the air to 20 degrees, turns off, the air cools to 19.9 degrees. The boiler turns on again, heats back to 20, turns off, cools to 19.9, on, off, cycling every few minutes without ever settling. The boiler is not broken. The thermostat is not broken. The rule is the problem. The threshold is too tight. There is no gap between the condition that triggers heating and the condition that stops it. So the system perpetually crosses and recrosses the same line. Never reaching an equilibrium it can stay in. The fix is a band of tolerance, a deliberate gap between the two thresholds. Heat on below 18 degrees, heat off above 22 degrees. Now the boiler turns on when the house genuinely cools, runs long enough to do meaningful work, turns off, and the temperature drifts back down over a long enough period that the boiler stays off for a useful stretch of time before being needed again. The system settles. This gap between the on threshold and the off threshold is called hysteresis, and it is the same mechanism that prevents scaling oscillation. Return now to the monitoring dashboard. The auto-scaling policy is set to add servers when average CPU utilization exceeds 70%, and to remove servers when average CPU falls below 65%. The gap between the two thresholds is 5 percentage points. That looks like a gap. In practice, it is not nearly wide enough. Here is what happens. Traffic is steady. CPU sits at 71% across 4 servers. The scale-out threshold is crossed. The policy adds 2 new servers. Those 2 servers join the pool and start absorbing traffic. The load is now spread across 6 servers. CPU drops, not to 65%, but to 58%, because adding 2 servers to a pool of 4 is a significant capacity increase. Now, the scale-in threshold is crossed. The policy removes a server. CPU climbs back to 68%, above the scale-out threshold again. Another server is added. CPU drops to 56%. Scale-in fires, and so the cycle runs. The problem is not the individual thresholds. The problem is that the policy fails to account for the size of its own interventions. Adding 2 servers to a pool of 4 does not nudge the CPU down by 5%. It drops it dramatically. The scale-in threshold sits so close to the scale-out threshold that every scale-out event automatically triggers the conditions for a scale-in event, and vice versa. The thresholds are not a band of stability. They are a pair of tripwires set close enough together that crossing one almost inevitably means crossing the other. The fix has 3 components, and all 3 contribute to a stable policy. The first is wider threshold separation, the hysteresis, the thermostat required. If the scale-out threshold is 70% CPU, the scale-in threshold should sit considerably lower, perhaps 40%, perhaps 35%. The exact values depend on how much capacity each new server adds relative to the pool, but the principle is consistent. The gap needs to be wide enough that a scale-out event does not immediately satisfy the conditions for a scale-in, and a scale-in event does not immediately satisfy the conditions for a scale-out. The second component is cooldown periods, which exist precisely for this reason. A cooldown period prevents the scaling policy from firing again within a defined window after it has just fired, typically 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the application. Even if the metric crosses a threshold again immediately after a scaling action, the policy will not respond until the cooldown has elapsed. This gives the newly added or removed capacity time to stabilize, the metrics time to reflect the new steady state, and the system time to settle before being asked to change again. The third component is metric averaging. Rather than triggering on an instantaneous reading, CPU is at 72% right now. The policy triggers on a sustained average. CPU has been above 70% for the past 5 minutes. A transient spike that resolves quickly does not fire the policy. Only a genuine, sustained condition does. This reduces the sensitivity of the policy to noise, which in turn reduces the frequency of scaling actions, which in turn reduces the opportunities for oscillation to begin. These 3 components work together. Threshold separation prevents the direct feedback loop. Cooldown periods prevent rapid re-triggering. Metric averaging prevents reaction to noise. A well-tuned policy uses all 3. And the result is a system that scales when it needs to and remains stable when it does not. The analogy earns one final extension, and then it has reached the edge of what it can usefully carry. A thermostat with hysteresis is still a single-room system responding to a single sensor. Real auto-scaling policies deal with many metrics, multiple instance groups, and applications whose behaviour under varying server counts is not perfectly predictable. The principles carry across. Wider bands, cooldowns, averaging. But the specific numbers require observation of your actual system, not just the application of a formula. What you understand now is that oscillation is not a sign that auto-scaling is broken. It is a sign that the policy governing it does not account for the size and effect of its own interventions. The infrastructure is following its rules faithfully. The rules are producing a loop the system cannot escape. The solution is not to disable auto-scaling. It is to design the policy so that the gap between action and counteraction is wide enough that the system can reach a stable state and stay in it. That gap is the entire difference between infrastructure that manages itself and infrastructure that endlessly manages itself into instability.